نيجت نشكو سي شك
We will not walk away and leave a vacuum to be filled by China, Russia, or Iran. We'll seek to build on this moment with active, principled American leadership.
President Biden's visit to the Middle East draws sharp criticism at home as members of his own party accuse him of selling America's human rights principles for political expediency. Hello and welcome to Inside America with me, Ghida Fakhry. Joe Biden's four-day trip to Israel and Saudi Arabia last week has been widely criticized here in the United States for failing to achieve its objectives as the president continued to face questions about what his visit had accomplished. At the end of Biden's meeting with the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who, according to a U.S. intelligence report released last year, approved the 2018 murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi, there was no public Saudi commitment to pump more oil. The U.S. is hoping that Saudi Arabia will use its influence with other major oil-producing countries at next month's OPEC meeting to increase output. But with just a few 100,000 more barrels expected on the market, the impact on U.S. gas prices is likely to be limited. Facing growing domestic pressures and skyrocketing gas prices ahead of the crucial November midterm elections, Biden's decision to re-engage with Saudi Arabia, the world's second largest oil producer behind the United States, follows a long-standing U.S. tradition of American presidents who, once in office, reverse their campaign pledges to make the Saudi government accountable for its alleged human rights abuses. While U.S. imports of Saudi oil recently dropped to their lowest levels since the late 1980s, Saudi Arabia still occupies a strategically important position for U.S. interests in a region long viewed by many in Washington as America's sphere of influence. Biden's insistence that the U.S. will not walk away from the Middle East to leave a vacuum for China, Russia, and Iran drew a sharp rebuke from Beijing.
中东人民是中东的主人，中东不是谁家的后院，更不存在所谓的真空。
So can the U.S. re-establish its waning influence in the region? And was Biden's trip to Saudi Arabia worthwhile? Joining me now is Joseph Westphal, who served as U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia from 2014 to 2017. Ambassador Westphal, you were one of the last U.S. ambassadors to have served in Saudi Arabia. President Biden, in fact, still hasn't appointed an ambassador there. Why the vacuum if the country is so strategically important for the United States, as Biden's visit has demonstrated? And can the U.S. really play catch-up with Russia and China, whose influence in the region is on the rise with just one presidential visit?
I fail to understand why both President Trump and now President Biden have really failed to have an ambassador from the beginning there, especially somebody with influence and somebody who can really represent the interests of the United States to Saudi Arabia. I just don't understand that. I think it hurts our relationship, and I think it's has a negative impact.
What do you think came out of his visit? Because the reality for many people looking on was that President Biden gave in and got very little in return. In fact, he got promises at best. The Washington Post called it a low moment for Mr. Biden. He traveled to Saudi Arabia, engaged directly with the de facto leader there, the leader of a country he vowed to isolate. He ignored his own red line, essentially. Isn't that a low moment for Biden and the U.S.?
Yeah, I disagree with all of that. I disagree with that vehemently. I think this was a very, very important time to go there to begin with, both to Israel and to Saudi. I think it was an important visit, and I think a lot of ground was gained.
What was gained specifically?
Well, first of all, I think part of the intent of this visit was to solidify the relationships, or to begin to strengthen the relationships among the Gulf states, and also by bringing in Egypt, Jordan, and Iraq. You really have the significant part of the Arab world working together. that means that as crises arise, whatever they may be, whether they're security issues or trade issues, the United States can count on the Arab countries working together to resolve some of these issues. It doesn't require the United States to be fully engaged.
At what price, though? Because here you have an American president who goes all the way to Saudi Arabia to meet with the man his own US intelligence agencies said approved a gruesome murder. He violates his own red line and overturns what he said would be the cornerstone of his foreign policy, human rights. So at what price did this trip come?
Well, I don't think you give up, engaging in discussions of human rights or advocating for human rights or the values that we believe in, no matter what you do, and no matter who you're talking to, whether you're talking to Mohammed bin Salman, or you're talking to Putin, or you're talking to Xi, it doesn't matter. You don't give up that opportunity, and you always bring it up. President Obama, when I was ambassador, made 3 visits to Saudi Arabia, and in all 3, human rights issues were brought up by the president, and so I brought them up as well. So that's
well, of course, that's the essence of Realpolitik. We all understand it, and countless US presidents have done the same. I know you've served under 5, but President Biden vowed that he would make the country a pariah, and he caved in. It does reinforce, doesn't it, the view that the US only stands up for human rights when it suits its interests. I mean, that cannot be good for America's rules-based global order or its credibility.
No, I don't agree with that at all. I don't think you compromise that. I think you have to be realistic about the global situation that we face today and the need we have for strong partners.
Let me ask you about the security arrangements the United States has been pushing in the region. Biden trying to push countries into that closer security cooperation with Israel, essentially continuing Trump's policies. You previously served as Secretary of the Army in the Bush administration. There is now talk of a new military alliance, some kind of NATO for the Middle East, which may include Israel. Israeli leaders are talking about a new Middle East air defense alliance with Arab countries. Egypt has reportedly been hosting secret meetings to discuss defense cooperation. Won't these moves, though, to counter Iran, with the US's strong endorsement, help fuel more, not less, turmoil and instability in an already volatile region?
I don't think so. I think we actually worked very hard on this during the Obama administration as well, with the Gulf Cooperating Council, to help them achieve a greater sense of defense security. So it's not offensive. It's not offensive intended, but it's defensive intended. In other words, for them to be able to protect themselves against possible missile attacks or other attacks from Iran or whoever other bad actors in the region. So it's really more a security issue.
Ambassador Joseph Westphal, thank you so much for being with me.
Great to be with you too. Thank you.
President Biden began his trip to the Middle East in Israel, the first country he visited as a young US senator back in 1973. Arriving in Tel Aviv last week to kick off his visit to the region as America's 46th president, Biden reaffirmed his long-standing commitment to Zionism.
I did say, and I say again, you need not be a Jew to be a Zionist.
Despite pressure from a growing number of Democrats in Congress to condition aid to Israel, the Israeli government continues to receive $3.8 billion a year in U.S. military aid. Israel is the largest cumulative recipient of U.S. foreign assistance since World War II. Israel has long been the U.S.'s top recipient of foreign aid. The U.S. has also provided financial assistance to Arab countries that have made peace with Israel or normalized relations: Egypt, Jordan, and more recently the UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco. Richard Albright is a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State and Coordinator for Foreign Assistance in the State Department's Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs. He joins me now. Richard Albright, the Biden administration announced that it would give Palestinians $316 million as the president visited the occupied West Bank. Now, President Trump had ended nearly all aid to Palestinians 3 years ago when you were still serving in the State Department. Will any of this new money being essentially thrown at the Palestinian Authority, this modest aid, go very far in restoring Palestinians lost faith in the United States, which was badly damaged by its one-sided approach to Israel-Palestine for so many years?
Well, Ghida, thank you very much for your question, and thank you for having me. I would say that the restoration of the assistance to the Palestinians is part of a longer-term effort to restore our relationship with the Palestinians that were severed in the previous administration. The assistance is not going to the Palestinian Authority, it's going to the Palestinian people through several organizations. So the 2/3 of the funds that were, a significant portion of the funds that were announced, 200 million, a little bit more than 200 million, are going to UNRWA, the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees. This supports health and education programs, workforce development programs for Palestinian refugees in the West Bank and in Gaza, as well as in the region, throughout the region.
But as you know, though, Palestinians aren't looking for a few more $1 million, whether it is given to organizations on the ground or to what many consider to be a corrupt and inefficient Palestinian leadership. They want an end to the Israeli checkpoints, an end to the military occupation, an end to the forced evictions from their homes, the illegal settlement building, the extrajudicial killing of journalists with impunity. That's what they want. And they're not getting any signs that the United States will use any of its leverage to pressure Israel into ending its practices.
Improving the lives of Palestinians and improving the opportunity for Palestinians is a multifaceted challenge that we face. I think the aid money that you mentioned in the beginning is a part of that. It's to also improve healthcare for the Palestinians, and we have also contributed money to the East Jerusalem Hospital Network and also encouraged the Arab countries that have also pledged $100 million for that network. I think in parallel, the president, when he was there, talked about improving the daily lives of Palestinians and their efforts that the United States has been making with Israel to improve the border crossing at the Allenby Bridge so it's easier for Palestinians to travel and reduce some of the indignities that they suffer. And they've been working to improve the telecommunications capacity in the West Bank and in Gaza that will also spur more economic activity and more human relationships and ability for interconnectedness.
But you mentioned improving the daily lives of Palestinians. And is there much more that needs to be done by the US administration? Because as you know, many lawmakers here in Washington, Democrats, progressives, have been saying that US aid to Israel needs to be conditioned if the United States is serious about wanting to achieve peace and some semblance of justice for Palestinians. Should that aid be conditioned? Why is military aid to Israel beyond scrutiny? Because since the late 1990s, the US has had a law known as the Leahy Law, which covers all State Department-funded assistance. And it clearly prohibits, as you know, the Department of State and Defense from providing military assistance to foreign security force units that violate human rights with impunity. Why doesn't it apply to Israel as it does to other countries, mostly Latin American, African, and Muslim majority countries?
I think on that question, I would just say that security for the state of Israel has been a long-standing U.S. objective in the region for decades by multiple administrations, and that security assistance fits into that with that approach, and that one of the elements of the administration I think that they've done in the last administration as well really is encouraging regional integration, and there's security as an aspect of that regional integration that's occurring.
But what about the need to reset some kind of a balanced approach to the Israel-Palestine issue? Because from a US national security perspective, does it make sense for Israel, one of the wealthiest countries in the region, an occupying force, to receive so much aid from the US and to get a free pass essentially on everything it does in breach of international law? As Biden was visiting Israel, the Israelis began to forcibly expel Palestinians from their homes in the West Bank. Why isn't there any condemnation or any consequence?
Ghida, these are complicated issues. There's There are legal processes in Israel. There's a rule of law in Israel. But ultimately, there needs to be political dialogue, political progress, and a political solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
All right, Richard Albright, thank you so much for joining me. Really appreciate speaking with you.
Thank you, Ghida.
As Biden arrived in Israel, the Israeli government began the forced eviction of over 1,000 Palestinians from their homes in the occupied West Bank. But despite the president's silence and unwavering commitment to Israel, domestic support for Israel among American voters, particularly among Democrats, has been waning. In a recent poll, fewer than 1% of Democrats named Israel among the top 2 U.S. allies. Only 20% of Republicans identified Israel first or second. Reflecting the growing gap between the Democratic Party and voters, 15 House Democrats recently urged the Secretary of State to, quote, exert all available diplomatic pressure on Israel to stop the Israeli government's expulsion of Palestinians from their homes, which would amount, quote, to a war crime. In another letter, 81 members of Congress called on the administration to prevent Israel's evictions, which they described as inconsistent with international humanitarian law. But with midterm elections now less than 4 months away, pro-Israel lobby groups have been pouring millions of dollars into campaigns to unseat progressive lawmakers like Rashida Tlaib, the first Palestinian American to serve in the U.S. Congress. She is among several lawmakers who voted against giving Israel an additional $1 billion for its Iron Dome missile system and to stop the delivery of Boeing bombs to the Israeli government. Pro-Israel groups are investing heavily to defeat candidates for Congress who are willing to criticize Israel's policies towards Palestinians. One of those attempting to transcend the Israel lobby is Huwaida Arraf, a longtime Palestinian-American human rights activist and civil rights attorney. She is running for Congress in Michigan's 10th district. It's great to have her with us. Huwaida Arraf, I know you're in the midst of campaigning for Michigan's primary on the 2nd of August. How have voters in your district reacted, if at all, to Biden's visit to the Middle East? Do you think U.S. policy toward Israel-Palestine will affect the way they vote and which candidates they support when the cost of living in the U.S. is uppermost on people's minds?
Hi, thank you for having me. Yes, I am in the midst of campaigning. As far as what I'm seeing with the voters in my district, no, there has not been much focus at all or concern with Biden's trip to the region. First and foremost on the minds of voters here are the rising costs of living. People are having a hard time making ends meet. And other issues, local issues that are really at the front of their minds. So I've noticed very little attention paid to the trip. But having said that, your other question about how it affects voters' views and the elections here about policies or views towards the region. I am a longtime Palestinian human rights activist. I am known for the work I've done, and I have not shied away from the work that I've done, standing up to Israeli aggression and apartheid. I have not minced words, and I have not seen that has hurt me in any way amongst voters here, talking to people. If anything, it's been seen as a positive.
You haven't minced words. In fact, you've said that you want to cut off aid to Israel over its human rights violations. Your campaign's internal polling shows that Democratic voters are actually split on aid to Israel. 46% want to keep it at the same level, 44% want to reduce or end it. Now, when pollsters throw in the additional dimension of the alleged war crimes committed by Israel, 66% of respondents say that cutting all aid to Israel is a strong reason for voting for you, including 80% of Black voters. Are you seeing a growing gap between the political establishment, the Democratic Party, between elected officials and their constituents?
There is absolutely a gap. I was a delegate to the 2020 Democratic National Convention, and I, with other delegates, were very strong on trying to push certain policies, better policies and wording for the Democratic Party on their platform towards Palestine. And we had a lot of ground support, but it was the establishment, the kind of the mainstream, the corporate, again, establishment Democrats who we've seen a lot of voters become very frustrated with, but those were the ones pushing back. Those are the ones that are in the pockets of the pro-Israel lobby. And those are the ones that are quickly losing favor with a lot of Democratic voters.
That there seems to be a generational shift here in the US, as you mentioned, but there is one constant though, isn't there? Or is that beginning to change as well? Because candidates for political office in the US, whether it is Republicans or Democrats, still rely heavily, don't they, on the Israel lobby to get elected or to remain in office. Is supporting Israel still good politics, as the Israel lobby has always argued?
I would say it's not good politics. Unfortunately, we have a political system, a campaign finance system, where you have big money that controls politicians, and people are sick and tired of that. They feel that their voice is not being heard, that they are not being represented, and that their representatives are speaking and acting on behalf of those writing them the big checks, and that includes the pro-Israel lobby. Now, one of the things that I've been talking about at the doors is the desire and the fight to get big money out of politics. And be it Democrat or Republican, they agree that big money in politics is eroding our democracy. They want to see it out.
And what we're seeing is actually corroborated in your internal polling, which lines up with the wider national or nationwide trends. According to a recent Pew report, most young people have an unfavorable view of Israel, and less than half of Democrats have a positive view of the country. But not so long ago, running against Israel was seen as a major liability, as political suicide. Can you really stand up to the powerful pro-Israel lobby and succeed?
I think you very much can, and I think we've been seeing it happen over the last few years. We've seen Bernie Sanders retain his popularity when he almost did the unthinkable by refusing to go to the national AIPAC conference when he was running back in 2016. And then a more and more, Michigan elected Palestinian American Representative Rashida Tlaib, who has not been silent also on Israeli violations of Palestinian human rights. Representative Cori Bush, who the pro-Israel lobby tried to attack her just weeks before her election, saying that she supports terror and she supports the global boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. And she doubled down. She also did not mince her words or tried to apologize for her stance. And she won her seat and has continued to be vocal and continues to retain support. So it's not about, as much as the pro-Israel lobby would like to continue to flex their muscles and think that they are important, and unfortunately they continue to be able to raise millions to dump into political campaigns, all of their millions are not able to stand up to the awakening of Americans, not only towards wanting to see their country do better on human rights, but also being completely disgusted with the power of these lobbies, these special interest groups, to buy our politicians. We just don't want it anymore.
Huwaida Arraf, running for US Congress in less than 2 weeks. Good luck with the campaigning. I know you have lots of work to do. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you for having me.
Now, Biden's visit to the Middle East will likely long be forgotten by the time American voters head to the polls for the next election cycle in November. But the trip illustrates the deepening predicament the president and his party are in. While he was away, Biden's approval rating hit a new low of 33%, the second lowest of any president at this stage in their presidency. Only 13% of Americans say the country is heading in the right direction, and 64% of Democrats say they would prefer someone else as the party's nominee in 2024. The president's Middle East gamble has hardly paid off. Inflation has hit a new high and gas prices continue to rise. His trip to Saudi Arabia and Israel has exposed the limits of America's power and influence in the region as it bends to a new realism. The growing influence of China, Russia, and Iran, and the deepening economic and security ties between them, as the US continues to push Arab countries closer into Israel's orbit to contain Iran. Biden's tour wasn't just about reasserting America's role in the region and securing more oil to contain the political fallout from high gas prices in the US. It was also intended to push forward a regional network of US and Israeli-powered air and missile defense capabilities to counter Tehran's growing military clout and the delivery of weapons-capable drones to Moscow. While Saudi Arabia and Israel each got what they wanted from the visit, America's blessing and support, it is far less clear what the US got in return. And so, in short, while Biden's attempts to reassure the region's close U.S. allies and willing partners of America's staying power, despite its visibly diminishing influence, his pivot back to the Middle East will be fraught with road bumps along the way, and it will likely take more than just a few fist bumps for the U.S. to recapture its pole position. That's all from me, Ghida Fakhry, from the team in Washington. Thanks for watching.